Welcome to the second part of Chapter 2. This particular section of the chapter is going to focus on energy and how we make energy, especially for sport. The way that we use energy is, or the way that we manufacture energy is chemically. So we have chemical energy is the source of allowing our muscles to produce a contraction to be able to do work. The production of energy, or the type of energy that we use, is ATP. And to produce ATP, we use carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Those are the only three macronutrients that are used for energy production. Now, there are micronutrients that are involved in enzymes to make the chemical production of ATP to be much faster, but the source of the basic source are carbs, fats, and proteins, primarily carbohydrates and fats. The production of the ATP ADP cycle is circular in its picture, but it really isn't circular. It doesn't, it's just the way that we typically draw it. But what you see is that energy, it's primarily the shifting of a PI, which is an inorganic phosphate molecule, which binds on to the adenosine diphosphate, and then it becomes an ATP. When ATP releases a phosphate molecule, energy is released. The base of ATP is adenosine, and it is a matter of how many phosphates are attached. And the phosphate that is linked to the adenosine molecule, you'll see, is just a straight line. That is a normal bond, but the little squiggles that are between the phosphates is indicating a high energy bond. So when that phosphate is broken off, that means that that bond breakage releases energy. So it's called a high energy bond. When each phosphate, so there are two high energy bonds, so breaks off once, it becomes an adenosine diphosphate. Breaks off again, it becomes an adenosine monophosphate. During the metabolic reactions, these phosphate bonds form or break to capture or release energy. Three energy systems are the phosphagen, anaerobic, and aerobic energy system. Let's look at those three systems a little bit more carefully. Figure 2.23 demonstrates the connection between or actually how the macronutrients are feeding into the energy system. And the macronutrients are going to be obtained through digestion, as was discussed in the first chapter, or actually in the first part of this chapter. And the macronutrients are absorbed into the muscle cell as either a protein, fat, or carbohydrate. And you'll see that the carbohydrates are the only source that can go into the anaerobic energy system. And you see that right here at this blue arrow. Carbohydrates, fats, and proteins all can feed into the aerobic energy system. Notice here that phosphagen by itself does not require a macronutrient, but this indicates that you have some requirement of oxygen in the aerobic system to make ATP, and you have the phosphagen, aerobic, and anaerobic system all contributing to this ATP pool, ultimately producing ATP. Now, when you make energy, you're going to, because you're having a chemical reaction, you're always going to have some leftover substances, and it's going to be a hydrogen ion, water, carbon dioxide, and lactate. It's really easy to think that one of the energy systems is superior to the others. And I think we can step back for a moment and look at how each of them have a specific role depending on what the sport is and when it is contributing to energy production in a sport. So the phosphagen, it is really a simple, very easy, quick system, very few steps. It has a very rapid production of ATP, but it cannot produce very much ATP. And so it doesn't have a real long lasting production factor. The anaerobic function or anaerobic system has a moderate number of steps in comparison to the aerobic system. It is relatively it's faster than the aerobic system. It does have some limitations in how much ATP it can produce in terms of um, how intense a person works. It does have a limitation. However, it can contribute faster, relatively quickly compared to the aerobic system, which you see can take a couple minutes to contribute to producing energy. We see that the aerobic pathway has many more potential components to it than the other two systems. So beta oxidation, glycolysis, deamination, citric acid cycle, and electron transport chain. So those are different actions or steps within the aerobic cycle. The complexity of the aerobic cycle is there because the steps of breaking down the macronutrients are going to be specific for the macronutrient. So to break down a fat, it takes a different pathway than to break down a carbohydrate, than to break down a protein. Once those components are broken down, then they get uh, fed into a common cycle, which is the citric acid cycle, or it's also called the tricarboxylic acid cycle, or you might have heard it called the Krebs cycle. All three macronutrients feed into that cycle, but ultimately the big energy producer is going to be in the electron transport chain. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the steps of breaking down each macronutrient requires a different preliminary step. For carbohydrates, it first has to go through glycolysis before it can go into the citric acid cycle. Fats have to go through beta oxidation, and proteins have to be deaminated. Then all go through the tricarboxylic acid and electron transport. So now you can see how the macronutrients all feed in to the aerobic, anaerobic systems and ultimately produce ATP to the ATP pool and ultimately produce energy to do work. The phosphagen energy system has just basically one step. Creatine phosphate has that high energy phosphate bond. It basically breaks off, gives that phosphate, that high energy opportunity for phosphate to bind onto that adenosine diphosphate. And that ADP now has three phosphates or two high energy phosphate bonds. These two high phosphate bonds are really the carrier of energy that is the production of, or really the storage of energy that's in our body. And what this flip around of cycling back and forth occurs snappity snap, and it gives us energy at the right away the first couple seconds of exercise, and that gives us that immediate burst of energy from out of a starting block. If you've had exercise physiology, you've already walked through the glycolytic cycle and probably know all of the steps and the enzymes that are involved in that. If you haven't, I don't expect you to memorize those. But what you do want to recognize is that the carbohydrates are the only macronutrient that can go through the glycolytic cycle. And this anaerobic, which means without oxygen, breakdown of carbohydrates takes ATP to occur. So here you have two molecules of ATP that are needed to break down that carbohydrate or that glucose. It's basically a glucose molecule into two halves. It splits it in half, and you have two components that further get broken down, and this is where you produce ATP, ultimately getting down to what's called pyruvate, and that's at the bottom of this arrow. And here's where lactate comes in. Lactate is a simple byproduct that if there is no place for that pyruvate to go, to continue to generate energy, the pyruvate will be converted into lactate. So it's basically the concentration of pyruvate decreases, it doesn't build up, and glycolysis can continue. So what lactate does is help to allow anaerobic glycolysis to continue to break down carbohydrate and to make energy for the short term. The aerobic energy system requires oxygen, and all three macronutrients can be metabolized aerobically. The fats need to go through what's referred to as beta oxidation first to be fed into the citric acid cycle. Carbohydrates must first go through glycolysis, and proteins are on the far right. They need to be broken down, and first the nitrogen has to be broken off, and that's deamination. Now, proteins can enter into can be metabolized can enter into the aerobic system through pyruvate as directly into acetyl-CoA or as components within the citric acid cycle. So although it looks like it's a very handy, easy to use substrate, it actually is very costly and it's not used readily. Ultimately, this system requires oxygen. Carbohydrate is an important fuel, and it impacts not only fat metabolism but also protein metabolism. And when we don't consume sufficient carbohydrate, we end up having a little bit more greater reliance, or what ends up happening is our muscle protein breaks down and we lose muscle mass. And that is partially because of part of the components within the citric acid cycle can be formed by protein components. And so we rely on some of the protein to be converted into glucose to be utilized for energy. So actually, carbohydrates are very, very important for sparing muscle mass. Our ability to produce ATP requires these energy sources, these energy systems. And these energy systems, all ultimately, the goal of each one or the function of each one is to produce ATP. And they all build upon this ATP pool in different functions or in different, they contribute in a different way. So depending on where that energy is needed or how that energy is needed, we're going to rely more on one system than the other. When the activity is high intensity, short duration, the pool of ATP that is drawn from is produced by the system that can make it the quickest and the most the most rapidly, and that is going to be our ATP-PC, or our phosphagen system. It's just that pass back and forth between creatine and creatine phosphate. So the phosphagen system is for our short duration activities, 10 seconds at maximum, all out activity. When an activity lasts a little bit longer, so not that quick high intensity burst of motion. If it's a longer sprint, so it's high effort but shorter or longer duration than that just big burst, we need to draw ATP a little bit longer. We'll run out of that ability to uh, rely solely on phosphagen because that only lasts maybe 7-10 seconds. So then we have to start pulling on our next system, and that's where carbohydrates are going to start feeding through that glycolysis system, and that's our anaerobic energy system. So that starts turning, and remember, we only get a couple ATP from that. It's not really generous, but it'll give us enough ATP in that pool to keep us um, uh, managing to be able to continue that activity. And that's for our long sprint of 1 to 3 minutes of high intensity, all out activity. We don't always do a movement or an activity at the same intensity. So we might have a really high burst and then back off a little bit, or then do another burst of activity. So if you think of HIIT, uh, interval training, for example, our phosphagen anaerobic and aerobic systems are going to contribute in differing proportions. So when we look at our arrows, no matter what, phosphagen is going to be a smaller portion, demonstrated by that very thin arrow. It's never going to turn off. It's always going to be working. However, its contribution, it doesn't have a large ATP contribution. The anaerobic is going to be contributing, and aerobic is also going to be contributing. But when we have these 4 to 6 minutes higher intensity, but it's non-steady state, more back and forth intensities, slower and then high burst, our anaerobic and aerobic are going to be both contributing, not quite equally, but they're both going to have a primary function. But know that these systems are going to be relied upon depending upon the intensity. And finally, when you have long duration steady state, our biggest contributor is going to be aerobic energy system. And that's going to be our primary source of ATP for fueling our exercise. This is a great way of being able to see how our sources of fuel change over time and change over intensity. So we primarily use fat or carbohydrate. Our fat can be located in little lipid molecules within the muscle, and that's going to be our muscle lipids, the orange. We also have plasma lipids, and that's the lipids, the triglycerides, fats that are floating in our plasma. That's the kind of the periwinkle color. The plasma glucose is the green, lime color green, and the purple is muscle glycogen. So what we store in our muscle what we work to store, the carbohydrate that we store in our muscle. So as exercise time proceeds, we'll see that we really rely heavily on our muscle glycogen. And then as time goes on, as we utilize that fuel, we can maintain our carbohydrate utilization. We start to rely more on blood glucose, but we have to really rely more on, but we have fat to utilize as well. So we initially will use some muscle lipids, but more and more we'll start to use some from the plasma. So we have primarily carbohydrate and fat that's utilized for energy during exercise, and that shifts over time. We see that intensity also influences. So when we have a very low intensity exercise, and we're just going to look at this, say 50%, say, right? See if I can get a little marker. Here we go, little marker. If you look at 50%, right in the peak of primarily muscle lipids, that orange peak, we're utilizing some plasma lipids, we're utilizing plasma glucose, and a large amount of muscle glycogen. As the intensity rises, we'll see that we really rely more on muscle glycogen at higher intensity exercise and also on our plasma glucose. Muscle fat, not as heavily. So at higher intensity exercises, we're going to really rely on our glucose and our glycogen. And that's why when we get into the next chapter, when we look at carbohydrates, why carbohydrates are so significant, especially for high intensity exercise.